Hello everyone, friends, and welcome to our archive of the most incredible stories. Here, we prove that reality is far crazier than any fiction, and the history books have overlooked the most intriguing parts. Today, you will learn about how an entire nation seriously believed that spaghetti grew on trees, how one daring individual cooked an omelet while standing on a tightrope above Niagara Falls, and how people rode on a tram that navigated the ocean floor on gigantic legs. Before we dive in, please give us a thumbs up and leave some comments. This truly helps the channel grow. Now, let's get started. Story number 1. The day when pasta grew on trees and an entire nation believed it. Imagine London, the gray, foggy, prim London of the mid-20th century. To be precise, it's April 1st, 1957. At that time, for the average Briton, spaghetti was not just food. Oh no. It was a delicacy, something strange, distant, Italian, almost extraterrestrial. In stores, it was exclusively sold in cans, already floating in tomato sauce. Few understood how it was made. From flour, from potatoes. Perhaps it was just long worms? Nobody really knew. And so, let's say, this gap in knowledge was about to be exploited. That evening, millions of families gathered around their black and white televisions to watch the panorama. This was the country's leading news program. It was hosted by Richard Dimbleby, a steadfast figure, the voice of the nation. People believed him unconditionally. If Dimbleby claimed the sky was green, then it must be true. We were just looking at it wrong. And this serious gentleman, staring directly into the camera with a composed demeanor, declares, "Thanks to an unusually mild winter and the complete eradication of the pesky weevil, Swiss farmers have harvested a record crop of spaghetti this year." Silence. Footage appears on screen. Sunny Switzerland, an idyllic landscape. Happy peasant women in traditional costumes approach trees, ordinary leafy trees, and start plucking long strands of boiled spaghetti from the branches. They carefully place them into woven baskets and then lay them out in the sun to dry the harvest. The voiceover authoritatively discusses how difficult it is to ensure all the pasta pieces grow to the same length. This, he explains, is the result of many years of cultivation. What happened next? It's hard to describe. The BBC's phone lines practically melted from the influx of calls. Thousands of people couldn't care less that it was April 1st. They were not calling to laugh, oh no. They called with just one question. Where can we buy spaghetti seedlings? We want to grow it in our garden. It was a triumph. Absurdity elevated to new heights. People argued seriously about which variety would fare better in the English climate. They worried about frost, inquired about fertilizers. Channel employees, barely suppressing their laughter, answered all the eager gardeners with one brilliant phrase. Place a spaghetti strand in a jar of tomato sauce and hope for the best. It is said that even the Director General of the BBC, upon hearing the news, reached for an encyclopedia to verify whether pasta actually grows on trees. This story teaches us one simple yet significant lesson. Authority is a formidable force. If you don a sharp suit, adopt a serious expression, and speak with confidence, people will believe anything. Even that a flour product can blossom on the branches of a Swiss oak. Yet sometimes one wishes the world could be just that, a touch magical and incredibly delightful. Now, let's move on to story number 2. Imagine a banker who sent an entire building through the mail, one stamp at a time. We have all, at some point in our lives, stood in line at the post office, box in hand, shifting from foot to foot, hoping the weight of the package does not exceed the allowable limit. Otherwise, extra charges await. This is routine, an everyday occurrence. But picture yourself in that same queue, confronted by a person wanting to mail a bank. Not money, nor documents, but the entire building, brick by brick. It sounds like the ramblings of a madman or the setup for a poor joke. Yet, believe it or not, this was the undeniable truth, and frankly, it stands as one of the most brilliant bureaucratic pranks in history. Let's take a trip to Utah in 1916, specifically to the small town of Vernal. It was a remote place, to say the least. There was no railway, and the roads were in such disrepair that wheels would fall off carts after just a mile. A local businessman named William Coulterp recognized a pressing need for a solid, attractive bank building, one that was stone and reliable, making clients feel that their money was safe. There was one significant problem. Quality bricks were manufactured in Salt Lake City, nearly 200 kilometers away through rugged mountainous terrain. Transporting goods via wagon cost an exorbitant amount, essentially rendering each brick nearly priceless. Any reasonable person would have abandoned the idea or opted for a wooden structure instead. However, Coulterp was not just any businessman. He was someone who knew how to read the rules, especially those written in fine print. He consulted the charter of the United States Postal Service and discovered a surprising fact. It turned out that mailing packages was significantly cheaper than hauling freight through private transport companies, considerably cheaper. What was even more intriguing was that the regulations didn't specify what couldn't be sent, as long as it wasn't explosive or perishable. At that moment, the light bulb must have gone off in his mind. Coulterp sat down, grabbed a calculator, or whatever device they had back then, and crunched the numbers. Then, he put his plan into action. One fine day, postal workers in Salt Lake City probably thought they had lost their minds, as thousands of bricks were delivered to the post office. Each brick was carefully packed in boxes weighing slightly less than 23 kilograms, the maximum allowed for a single package. Picture the beleaguered postal workers dealing with this scenario. 80,000 bricks. Not 10, not 100, but 80,000. All were treated like ordinary packages, affixed with stamps and sent off to Vernal. The United States Postal Service was obligated to deliver them. A logistical crisis loomed over the state of Utah as warehouses became filled to overflowing with red clay bricks. The postal vans creaked and groaned under the weight of the letters. It's said that the postmaster of Vernalia nearly turned gray when he realized he would have to sort through an entire building's worth of mail. Nevertheless, they managed to do it. Every single brick reached its intended recipient. In the end, the building was erected. They named it the Vernalia Bank. Local residents humorously dubbed it the bank that was sent by mail. And the funniest part? The shipping cost Coulterp mere pennies compared to what freight carriers were asking for. Of course, the celebration didn't last long. The Postal Service, realizing the extent of the disaster and tallying up losses from broken backs of the laborers and the suspension systems of the vans, urgently revised its regulations. Just a few weeks after the special operation wrapped up, a new clause appeared in the statute. Sending entire buildings by mail is prohibited. Seriously, that was explicitly stated, but it was already too late. The bank stood, and it still stands today, by the way, a beautiful brick monument to human ingenuity, and a reminder that sometimes the shortest route to a goal lies through a post office. Story number 3. The man who bought his own wife at an auction, and everyone was happy. So, are you ready for some romance? But I'll warn you right away. This love story is so bizarre that modern melodrama screenwriters would pale in comparison. We tend to think that people from the past were strict and everything was dignified and noble. But in reality, our ancestors had a way of dealing with marital issues that, believe it or not, was surprisingly straightforward. England, the late 16th century. Picture a marketplace. Mud, noise, the cries of vendors. Someone is selling geese, another is peddling old boots, someone else is offering a sack of grain. Just another ordinary market day. And then a man appears in the crowd. Let's call him, say, Henry. He looks a bit weary but determined. Next to him stands a woman, his wife, with a rope around her neck. Not tight, more like a symbolic leash. Henry climbs onto a barrel and loudly proclaims, "Wife for sale. Bad temper, but she's strong and healthy." The starting price? A mug of beer. Shock, horror, barbarity to us undoubtedly, but for impoverished English folk of that time, this was a way out. Yes, you heard right, this was called wife selling. It sounds outrageous, I agree. But let's unpack why this was actually happening. The thing is, an official divorce in England during those years was an affair reserved strictly for the wealthy. One could obtain a special permit from Parliament, paying a fortune to lawyers. The average laborer or farmer couldn't even dream of such a thing, and living with an unloved person for a lifetime was no pleasure at all. So, the people devised their own little hack. The most astounding aspect of this story is that the woman was usually not a victim but a co-conspirator. Often, this whole process was a pre-planned performance. Here's how it worked. The husband and wife recognized that their marriage was fracturing. Love had faded, the thrill was gone, and perhaps the wife had already found a new heartthrob. Let's call him John. So, this trio, husband, wife, and lover, would sit down for a chat, probably in a pub, and make arrangements. "Listen," the husband said. "How about I sell you to John at the fair?" "Sure," the wife agreed. "Just don't let him raise the price too high. I wouldn't want to be embarrassed in front of the neighbors." And so they made their way to the market, setting up for bidding. A crowd of onlookers gathered to watch, cracking jokes. The husband would either praise or criticize the merchandise. John, the lover, would emerge from the crowd and make an offer, usually just a few coins or drinks for everyone present. They would shake hands and the deal was done. Everyone left satisfied. The husband was relieved of his responsibilities, and the wife went off with her beloved man. In the eyes of society, this arrangement was regarded as a perfectly legitimate marriage. No bureaucracy, no lawyers involved. Of course, there were humorous incidents. Once, it is said, a farmer sold his wife, but after a month of missing her, he bought her back for double the price. Inflation, you know. Or there was the case of a woman who started bidding at the auction herself, claiming her husband was asking way too little for her. "What are you thinking?" she yelled. "I'm worth at least 2 sheep." This tradition surprisingly lasted quite a long time, almost until the beginning of the 20th century. Newspapers of that era were filled with ads, such as, "Wife sold for 5 shillings and 1 rotten fence." It's funny, somewhat sad perhaps, but there's a certain honesty to it. People, cornered by harsh laws and poverty, found ways to be happy, even if it was through such a ridiculous theatrical manner. They simply wanted freedom. And if that meant putting a rope around their necks and standing in the square for half an hour, well, that was not too great a price for a new life. Story number 4. The politest invader in history, who came to war and apologized. War is always portrayed as chaos, gunfire, screams, and confusion in films. But history has known instances where military invasions resembled a visit from distant relatives, arriving unannounced and feeling quite sorry for the inconvenience. Let's take a trip to the sunny island of Guam. June 1898. Guam was then a Spanish colony, but to be honest, it was a very sleepy, distant colony, forgotten by both God and king. Life flowed so slowly there that even coconuts dropped from the palms lazily. Governor Juan Marina was enjoying his siesta, sipping wine, and was absolutely convinced that everything in the world was calm. There was no internet, no radio, and the mail ship arrived every couple of months. It was bliss. He just didn't know one small detail. His country, Spain, had already been at war with the United States of America for 2 months. One fine day, a daunting silhouette appeared on the horizon. It was the American cruiser Charleston. Captain Henry Glass had clear orders to capture the island. Being a true military man, he prepared for battle. The guns were loaded and the crew was on edge. The cruiser entered the harbor and fired several warning shots at the old Spanish fort of Santa Cruz. Boom, boom, boom. The Americans waited for a counterattack, expecting screams, panic, and soldiers running about. But on the shore, there was silence. No one was shooting. No one was running. The palms swayed and the waves lapped gently. After some time, a small boat pushed off from the shore. Inside, several Spanish officers are seated. They rowed towards the cruiser, smiling and waving their hands, and then board the ship. The Americans, puzzled, keep their hands resting on their holsters. At that moment, a Spanish officer bows and utters a phrase that would become a hallmark of misunderstanding. "Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for such a wonderful salute in our honor. We sincerely apologize for not being able to return the gesture. You see, our powder at the fort has gone stale, and our cannons are quite old, but we truly appreciate your greeting." Captain Glaze must have been rendered speechless. Here he is on the deck of a warship, having just fired upon the enemy, while that same enemy thinks they're receiving a friendly visit. "What a salute!" he finally manages to exclaim. "We were shooting at you. We are at war. You are under arrest." Now it's the Spaniards who have lost their ability to speak. "War?" the officer asks again. "With you? No way, we weren't aware." The situation was so absurd that Captain Glaze decided against shackling anyone. He simply explained the political situation to them. The Spaniards were not upset because they had lost. Rather, they were distressed about being in such an awkward predicament. They politely requested permission to return to the shore to gather their belongings and say farewell to their families. The captain granted it. The next day, the Spanish garrison lined up in the square, surrendered their weapons, which, judging by appearances, had not been firing anyway, and officially capitulated. Without a single drop of bloodshed, and without any actual gunfire, the Americans hoisted their flag, shook hands with their former foes, and peacefully went their separate ways. This was perhaps the only instance in history where one party lost a battle simply because they were behind on the news cycle. And you know, if all wars ended in apologies for not returning a salute, the world would indeed be a much better place. Story number 5. How one gardener saved an entire continent from the curse of prickly plants. We often hear how a single individual inadvertently causes damage, spilling oil, pressing the wrong button, or bringing rabbits to Australia. You're familiar with these stories. Yet, we hear far less about those who quietly and modestly avert disasters, and do so with the help of butterflies. Australia in the early 20th century. Frankly speaking, farmers' fortunes could not have been worse. It all began, as it usually does, with good intentions. Some bright individual brought the cactus, Opuntia, to the continent. A beautiful, hardy plant, it was perfect for hedges. He planted it around his house, admired it, and then forgot about it. But Opuntia did not forget. It thrived in Australia, where there were no natural enemies and the climate was just right. It began to spread aggressively. It resembled a slow-motion horror movie. Cacti were overtaking the land at a rate of 1 million acres per year. Imagine, you go to bed, and when you wake up, your garden is nothing but thorns. You abandon your home, relocate, yet within a year, the prickles catch up with you there too. Opuntia devoured pastures, choked forests, and blocked roads. Farmers went bankrupt. The government was in a state of panic. They tried everything. They resorted to poisons, resulting in dead cattle, while the cacti remained. They rolled over them with heavy machinery, burned them down with flames, even offered large rewards for a solution to the crisis. Everything was in vain. The green and spiky monster seemed to mock humanity as it sprouted new appendages. By the mid-20s, the disaster zone had expanded to the size of Great Britain. This is where our hero Allandot made his entrance, a biologist, entomologist, and essentially a person who placed his faith in the power of nature over chemistry. He embarked on a journey not for gold or glory, but to South America, the native land of this cactus, in search of its natural enemies. The logic was simple. Since cacti hadn't taken over the world here in Argentina, someone must be eating them. Allandot climbed mountains, wandered through deserts, collected beetles and spiders, and made a discovery. It was called Dot, after the area with the cactus. It sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but in truth, it was a small, inconspicuous gray moth. More specifically, its caterpillars. These little guys were true gourmets, eating nothing but Opuntia. They burrowed into the succulent leaves, devouring them from the inside and leaving only the dry skins. Allandot brought these insects to Australia, taking a significant risk. What if they began to consume wheat, apples, or, heaven forbid, eucalyptus? But Dot conducted thousands of tests. He starved the caterpillars, offering them every plant on the continent. They perished, but showed no interest in anything except their despised cactus. In 1926, he set them free. It was the quietest and most efficient war in history. Billions of tiny orange caterpillars marched toward the green walls. People could hear the crunching. Seriously, it is said that if you stood near a field, you could hear the dodo army having breakfast. Within a few years, the green hell had turned to dust. The land was cleansed, farmers returned to their homes, and the economy was saved. All thanks to a single butterfly and one stubborn scientist who knew where to look. In the town of Astonishing, Queensland, grateful residents even erected a monument, not to a general or a politician, but to the caterpillar. An ordinary caterpillar on a pedestal. And you know what? It deserved it. After all, sometimes to conquer a giant monster, you need not a sword or a tank, but someone very small with a very big appetite. Story number 6. A mailbox that swam faster than ships. The world of seafaring is filled with legends of ghost ships and treasures, but few know of the most modest yet remarkably effective employee of maritime mail who served sailors for almost 300 years. And it wasn't a person or a dolphin. It was a rock. Yes, an ordinary rough stone, or nearly so, at the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, a place where two oceans meet, where storms break masts like matchsticks. In the 15th century, it was the edge of the world for Portuguese sailors. With no internet and no satellites, leaving for India meant your family might not know for years whether you were alive or feeding fish. Around the year 1500, Captain Pedro de Taita, caught in a fierce storm, decided to leave a message in case they didn't survive, or simply to warn others. He landed at Mossel Bay, found a large milkwood tree, still standing there today, and hid a letter in an old sailor's boot that he hung on a branch. A year later, Captain Juan de Nova stumbled upon this shoe by chance, read the letter, and realized it was brilliant. Thus, the most unusual postal service in the world was born. As time passed, the shoe deteriorated, prompting sailors to devise a more reliable system. They chose a massive stone with an odd shape, resembling a mailbox, and began placing letters beneath it or carving messages directly onto the rocks nearby. The rule was simple and sacred, an unwritten code of honor. Any ship traveling from India to Europe was required to stop in this bay, look under the postal stone, collect letters addressed to their homeland, and leave their own for those heading in the opposite direction. This system functioned flawlessly. Imagine writing a letter to your wife in Lisbon, placing it under a stone in a wild African bay, and sailing away, only for another captain you've never met to take it and deliver it home for free, simply because he's a sailor and you are a sailor. This stone post office operated for centuries. Beneath it were left not only love notes, but also important reports about currents, pirates, and fresh water sources. It was like an offline chat for mariners. Remarkably, letters were rarely lost. The honesty of people united by the perilous sea was stronger than any lock. Today, these stones with carved inscriptions such as, "Here was a ship of such and such, all is well, we are heading east," are preserved in museums across South Africa. They appear as ordinary cobbles, but upon closer inspection, they stand as monuments to human trust. The trust in a stranger who might find your message at the edge of the world and not discard it, but instead carefully deliver it home. By the way, the very tree that once bore the first shoe is now officially recognized as a national monument. It is over 500 years old, and locals still refer to it as the postal tree. You can even send a postcard from there with a special postmark. Yet, to be honest, placing a note under a stone seems much more romantic to me. Story number 7. The musician who played on a fence. And it was brilliant. When we think of musical instruments, visions of a Stradivari violin, a Royal Steinway piano, or at least a Fender guitar come to mind, something crafted by a master, polished and expensive. However, music exists everywhere. Sometimes, in order to create a masterpiece, rare wood isn't required. Stalactites will suffice. Let's travel to Virginia, to the Luray Caverns, deep underground where it is dark, damp, and smells of eternity. In 1954, Leland Sprinkle, a mathematician and engineer from the Pentagon, a serious man by the way, visited there on a tour with his son. The tour guide, aiming to entertain the tourists, tapped a rubber mallet against one of the stalactites. A clear, vibrant sound rang out. Ding! Most people would simply smile and move on, but something clicked in Sprinkle's mind. He didn't just hear the sound of the stone, he heard a note, and a wild idea took shape. For the next 3 years, Leland spent his time in the cavern. Armed with a small hammer, a tuning fork, and a grinding machine, he crawled around the vast hall, tapping thousands of stone icicles hanging from the ceiling. He was in search of the perfect notes. It was a monumental task. Imagine finding a stalactite that resonates almost like fadis, albeit slightly lower. What to do? Sprinkle would take a grinding tool and carefully shave off an extra millimeter of rock to raise the pitch. Mistake. The stalactite is forever damaged, and it had taken millions of years to grow. He discovered and tuned 37 stalactites scattered across a cavern covering an area of 1.5 hectares. But how does one play them? Running back and forth with a stick from one wall to another is not an option. Being an engineer, Sprinkle devised a complex system. He connected each singing stone to a small rubber mallet activated by electricity. The wires were then extended to the center of the hall, where he set up a special console resembling a standard organ keyboard. Thus, the magnificent stalactite organ was born, the largest musical instrument in the world. An instrument created by nature over millions of years, with man simply teaching it to sing. When you press a key in the darkness from 100 meters away, the mallet strikes the stone, and the cave resonates with sound. It's unlike anything else. A deep, vibrating, somewhat mystical hum that emanates from everywhere all at once. The acoustics there are such that any concert hall would envy them. Sprinkle dedicated his entire life to this project. He received not a single penny for it. He merely wished for the stones to sing. And they still do. The automated system plays a lunar sonata, or hymns, for tourists. It's said that performing live on this organ is incredibly challenging. The sound reaches the performer with a delay of fractions of a second due to the distance, but those who have experienced it say the sensations are unforgettable. It is perhaps the only instance in history where the phrase "playing on the nerves of the earth" can be taken literally. Fortunately, it seems that the earth enjoys this music. Story number 8. The Prophet of Storms, who kept 12 leeches on payroll. Listen, have you ever wondered how much we rely on weather forecasts? We open an app on our phones, see a cloud icon, and grab an umbrella. It's straightforward. But imagine the mid-19th century, England during the Victorian era. The sea was not a place for vacations, but rather an enormous, hungry monster. Ships would venture into the fog and often did not return. Why? Because storms would strike unexpectedly, without warning. The year 1850. On the shores there was weeping and mourning. Meteorology as a science at the time resembled fortune-telling, whether by coffee grounds or fish entrails, depending on one's preference. And then Dr. George Merisser made his entrance. A very serious individual, a scholar, but with a remarkably peculiar imagination. He noticed a small detail, a triviality that others might have overlooked. Merisser observed that ordinary medical leeches behaved restlessly before a storm. When atmospheric pressure drops, these slippery creatures begin to flail about in their jar, trying to climb to the top, as if sensing impending doom. Most people would simply say, "Well, leeches, what can you expect?" But the doctor went much further. He decided to build a machine, but not just any contraption with gears, no. He created perhaps the most bizarre living computer in human history. He named it the Storm Forecaster. Picture this contraption. It resembled an exquisite Gothic temple made of redwood and glass, a true work of art. Inside this temple, 12 glass bottles were arranged in a circle, and in each one, believe it or not, lived a leech. Yes, it formed an ensemble of 12 tiny meteorologists. The system was brilliant in its absurdity. At the neck of each bottle, Merisser placed a whale's baleen, connected to a small hammer and a bell atop the apparatus. The logic was impeccable. As a storm approached, the leeches would start to crawl up the glass. They would brush against the baleen. The baleen would tug on a string, triggering the hammer, and the bell would ring out. The doctor believed that the more leeches that rang the bell simultaneously, the greater the chance of a catastrophic hurricane. Merisser even suggested to the government that such devices be installed along the entire British coastline. He spent an entire year testing his machine and sending reports, Frankly, his leeches were rarely wrong. They were more accurate than any instruments of that time. In 1851, this miraculous apparatus was showcased at the World Exhibition in London, a vast crystal palace, throngs of ladies in voluminous gowns and gentlemen in top hats. And amidst all this splendor, 12 bottles filled with worms attempting to predict the weather. Alas, officials from the Admiralty looked at it, scratched their heads, and decided that relying on the whims of leeches was somewhat unseemly for a grand naval power. They preferred to develop conventional barometers. The project was abandoned. The doctor was disheartened, and the leeches likely retired comfortably. Ironically, today scientists confirm that leeches can indeed sense changes in pressure long before humans can. Merriweather was right, but the world was not ready for a technology that required fresh blood every month. Interesting, isn't it? What seems to us today as a ridiculous curiosity could have once saved hundreds of lives. But sometimes, great ideas are simply too eccentric for their time. Just like the next story, where a man attempted to deceive not the weather, but space itself. Story number 9. The Desert Ship, which got lost in Texas. Well, listen. Picture a classic Western. A dusty little town somewhere in Texas, 1856. The blazing sun. Horses are tied up outside the saloon, lazily swatting flies with their tails. Cowboys in wide-brimmed hats are slowly sipping whiskey. It's deadly dull, a silence all around. And suddenly, down the main street, swaying gently, a caravan of camels comes by. No, this isn't a mirage, and the cowboys haven't overindulged in cactus juice. This was an official, for heaven's sake, program from the United States Department of Defense. It all started when a man named Jefferson Davis, the very one who would later become president of the Confederacy, but who at the moment was just a secretary, thought, why not? He looked out over the endless scorched deserts of Arizona and New Mexico and realized that ordinary horses were simply dying there. They require water, they need oats, they seek attention. But camels? Camels don't care. They feast on thorns. They can go without water for an entire week. They are the perfect tanks of the 19th century. Davis secured $30,000 from Congress, quite a sum for that era, and dispatched an expedition to Egypt and Turkey. Now, just imagine the scene. A ship arrives at the Texas port, carrying 33 humpbacked passengers on its deck. Along with them came a camel driver named Haji Ali. The Americans, unable to pronounce his name, quickly dubbed him Hi Jolly, a friendly fellow, by the way. At first, everything was going splendidly. The camels carried loads that would have overwhelmed 5 mules. They covered 40 miles a day, where horses would collapse from exhaustion. The army was ecstatic. Davis rubbed his hands together and ordered 40 more. But there's always that damned but. You know what the issue was? It was temperament. American cowboys and soldiers were accustomed to horses. Horses were straightforward. But what about a camel? A camel is a bundle of pride, prickly hair, and a very distinctive odor. It turned out that American horses and mules would go into a frenzy at the sight of these creatures. They would break free from their ties, overturn wagons, and gallop into the sunset just to escape the scent of Egyptian bones. Moreover, camels bit and spat and had absolutely no intention of obeying commands in English. Then the Civil War struck. People no longer had time for exotic experiments. Camels were simply forgotten. Some were sold to circuses, others to zoos, but the majority were just released into the wild, into the desert. Go on, guys, live as you please. And this is where it gets interesting. Camels are incredibly resilient. Over the next 50 years, legends wandered throughout the American Southwest. Prospectors and hunters swore they saw enormous hump shadows in the twilight. A legend emerged about the Red Ghost, a colossal camel supposedly carrying a human skeleton tied to its back. People believed it so strongly that they were afraid to leave their homes at night. In reality, these were merely the very same abandoned animals who adapted perfectly and began to breed in the wild. The last known state camel was seen in Arizona in the early 20th century. It quietly chewed on a cactus, looking at an approaching car as if it were a complete absurdity. Hi Jolly, the very same driver, remains in America, becoming a local legend and even receiving a monument in the form of a pyramid topped with a copper camel. Thus, an ambitious project transformed into a desert fairy tale. We attempt to tame nature, but it simply fades into the sunset, leaving us bewildered. Speaking of attempts to tame something, in the next story, we will discuss a man who believed he could control not animals, but time, and almost succeeded. Story number 10. A raft that cost more than gold and was rented out for the evening. By the way, have you ever felt awkward because your phone isn't the newest model or your car isn't the brand you wished it to be? It happens, honestly. We are all hostages to status symbols. But just for a moment, imagine this. London, the year 1780. A lavish ball in the mansion of some aristocrat. Candles, silk, the chime of crystal. Suddenly, a gentleman enters the room. He is dressed in the latest fashion, but all eyes are not on his coat. He carries a pineapple under his arm. No, really, picture this scene. A man strolls through the hall, bowing to ladies and engaging in polite conversation, all while clutching a spiky fruit with a green crown. Everyone gazes at him in reverence, as though he has brought the queen herself. The truth is, during that era, a pineapple was not just a piece of fruit. It was a representation of immense wealth, the ultimate status symbol. Nowadays, we buy them at the supermarket for a few pennies without a second thought. Back then, however, one such fruit could cost about £8,000 in today's money. £8,000 for a single pineapple. Essentially, you could either purchase a small carriage with horses or that pineapple. Why was that? Well, firstly, logistics. Transporting it from the Caribbean to Europe in pristine condition was nearly impossible. They rotted faster than the ship could raise its sails, and every successful delivery was nothing short of a miracle. Secondly, growing it in England was a task for madmen. Huge glass houses, known as pineries, were constructed. They were heated with tons of coal, requiring entire armies of gardeners to tend to them. It was more challenging than launching a rocket into space. The pineapple was more temperamental than any diva. And here's where it gets interesting. Since only a select few, like nobles and dukes, could afford to buy a pineapple, a unique renting service emerged. I'm not joking. If you were an average gentleman wanting to impress your neighbors, you would go to a special shop and rent a pineapple for the evening. You would bring it to a party, delicately showcasing it to the guests all night long. No one, God forbid, would suggest eating it. That would be considered the height of wastefulness. Instead, it was merely carried like a luxury accessory, akin to a designer handbag. And by morning, as the carriage turned back into a pumpkin, you would carefully return the slightly withered yet still magnificent fruit to the shop, where it would be rented to the next lucky individual until it eventually turned to mush. People were so fascinated by this fruit that they began decorating their surroundings with its likeness. Take a look at the architecture from that period. Do you see the stone pineapples perched atop the gates or the columns of old mansions? Those aren't pine cones, they are pineapples. Signs that the homeowner was so wealthy and hospitable that they appreciated tropical delights. Even Christopher Wren, when constructing St. Paul's Cathedral in London, wanted to place giant gilded pineapples on the tower, to let God know that the English had it all when it came to delicacies. Eventually, steamships and new growing technologies made pineapples accessible to the masses. It ceased to be a royal treasure and became simply a dessert item. But every time you see this fruit, remember those times, the era when you could be the coolest guy in town just by having the right fruit under your arm. And you know what? It was a damn eco-friendly trend. No plastic, just vitamins and pride. Story number 11. The tram that decided it was a ship and went for a stroll on the sea. Let me ask you, have you ever dreamed of walking on water? Not in a metaphorical sense, but truly having the waves lapping at your feet while staying completely dry and, say, dressed to the nines, in a top hat with a cane and a cup of freshly brewed Earl Grey in hand. It sounds like the fantasy of a fatalist or a rather peculiar dream after a sweaty dinner. Yet truth be told, in the late 19th century in England, this was a reality. Picture Brighton in 1996. The Victorian era is in full bloom. People are enamored with technological advancements, steam, and electricity. Then enters a man named Magnus Folk, a true inventor, a madman, perhaps a genius, for sure. Magnus came up with an idea that would make any modern engineer's eye twitch. He resolved to construct a tram line right in the sea. Not a bridge, nor a tunnel. He laid the tracks directly on the ocean floor. Imagine this scene. The coast of La Manche. The tide comes in. And suddenly, about 100 meters from shore, something emerges from the water. It was a massive metal platform on 4 slender, incredibly long legs. The locals promptly nicknamed this marvel Long-Legged Daddy. Officially, it was known as the Brighton and Rottingdean Seaside Electric Railway. It was both majestic and utterly absurd. The legs of this behemoth stood over 7 meters tall. At the top was a luxurious deck, resembling the lounge of an expensive yacht, complete with plush sofas, carpets, and even a buffet. This contraption could accommodate up to 30 people. The tram slowly traversed the waves at a leisurely pace of around 8 kilometers per hour. The tracks were submerged at a depth of 4 meters during high tide. Passengers were thrilled, and why wouldn't they be? Riding a tram while the ocean roars beneath you, with splashes reaching the rails, and you're seated in warmth and comfort, it felt like magic. Magnus Folk had even anticipated safety, equipping it with life rings and a lifeboat just in case. Although, to be honest, the tram was so heavy that no storm could capsize it. However, as often happens with great and peculiar dreams, harsh reality and nature intervened. Just a week after its inauguration, Brighton was hit by a terrible storm, one of the strongest in decades. It destroyed the pier and severely damaged the Long-Legged Daddy. Magnus didn't give up. He repaired everything within 7 months. The tram once again sailed the sea. For several more years, it transported people, becoming a major attraction along the coast. But hold on, it wasn't quite that simple. Ultimately, the line was closed. Not due to accidents, no. The authorities decided to expand the coastal defenses, and the submerged rails hindered construction. Magnus was offered to move the line further out to sea, but it was too expensive. In 1901, the unique project came to an end. Today, all that remains of the Long-Legged Daddy are memories and a few concrete blocks on the seabed, visible during low tide. But listen, what audacity it was to build a tram that isn't afraid of the ocean. Sometimes I feel that we really need more individuals like Magnus Folk, who gaze at the sea and see not obstacles, but a magnificent path for the tram. Speaking of paths and journeys, our next story is about a place that also seemingly should not exist, yet has become a refuge for those who dared to defy gravity itself. Story number 12. The War of Bones, or how 2 esteemed professors hurled dinosaurs at each other. You know what the issue is with great scholars? They often behave like children in a sandbox. Only their sandbox is the size of an entire continent, and instead of shovels and buckets, they have dynamite and the remains of historical monsters. Frankly, this tale illustrates how wounded pride can turn science into a real Western filled with chases and espionage. Let's transport ourselves to Philadelphia in the year 1870. There lived 2 gentlemen, Edward Cope and Othniel Marsh. Both were wealthy, incredibly intelligent, and fanatically in love with paleontology. At first, they were even friends, exchanging letters and studying fossils together. But then came that unfortunate incident for them, and a great boon for us. It all started with one mistake, a small, frustrating blunder. Cope had assembled the skeleton of a massive marine lizard, the Elasmosaurus. He worked for months on it. And just when he proudly presented his work to the world, Marsh approached, took a look, and burst into laughter. He noticed that his colleague had mixed up the ends. Cope mistakenly attached the skull to the tail, thinking it was the long neck. This was embarrassing, a public shaming in scientific circles. Cope tried to buy up all the copies of the scientific journal where his error was published, but Marsh made sure that several copies remained in libraries, and thus the war began. An actual war of bones. They loathed each other, passionately, genuinely, down to their bones. Over the next 20 years, the 2 turned each other's lives into hell. They sent expeditions to the Wild West, to the scorched prairies of Wyoming and Colorado. But these were not merely excavations. This was a special operation. Listen, they hired spies to monitor each other's camps. They bribed workers. They intercepted shipments of skeletons at railway stations. It escalated to the point where they began blowing up quarries. Literally, when one group finished excavating and realized they couldn't take all the bones, they would set off dynamite and destroy the remaining fossils, simply so that the other guy wouldn't get them. Imagine the absurdity. Priceless remains of creatures that had lain buried in the earth for millions of years were turned to dust due to the whims of two elderly gentlemen in top hats. Marsh and Cope spent their vast fortunes on this rivalry. They would send scathing letters about one another to newspapers, accusing each other of incompetence and theft. Both ended up bankrupt. In the twilight of his life, Cope lived in a small apartment cluttered with boxes of bones, while Marsh was forced to seek a salary from the university that had once sponsored him. Yet here lies the irony. In this mad frenzy of hatred, they discovered over 130 new species of dinosaurs. Before their conflict, the world was only aware of 9: Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Diplodocus. We owe all these names to their rivalry. They were so eager to outdo one another that they propelled science forward at the speed of an express train. Wait, hold on. One of them even decided to poke fun at the other just before the final act. The cop bequeathed his brain to science, to be measured and prove he was smarter than the March. The March, however, did not accept the challenge and kept his brain to himself. This tale serves as a wonderful reminder that even from chaos, envy, and minor grievances, something magnificent can emerge. The key is to choose the right enemy, or at least not confuse one's head with the tail. Speaking of which, it highlights the importance of looking in the right direction. Our next story is about a man who discovered treasures where everyone else saw only trash and old paper. This changed not just science, but the lives of thousands. Story number 13. The Man Who Sold Cold and Water and Became a King. So, have you ever pondered over ice? Just a regular frozen chunk of water. In winter, it lies underfoot. We curse it when we slip on the sidewalk and wish it would melt away quickly. Free of charge, useless, a pile of cold debris. But imagine Boston in 1806. A young man named Frederick Tudor stands by the edge of a frozen pond, watching workers cut the ice. Suddenly, an idea strikes him. An idea so crazy that his friends literally thought he had baked in the sun, even though it was bitterly cold outside. Frederick decided to sell this ice. To whom? Neighbors? No. He chose to transport it to places where people had never seen snow. The Caribbean islands in the tropics, where the heat melts brains and cool beverages are merely a dream. Everyone laughed. Newspapers published mocking articles. Tudor had lost his mind, shouted the headlines. He wanted to haul water in leaky baskets across the ocean. But Frederick was as stubborn as a mule. He mortgaged his property, bought an old ship, and loaded its hold with 80 tons of pure Boston ice. The journey lasted 3 weeks under the scorching sun. When the ship docked on the island of Martinique, Tudor rushed ashore, beaming with joy. He had brought treasures, but an embarrassment occurred. The locals simply couldn't comprehend what it was. They looked at the clear, cold blocks with suspicion. Someone attempted to lick the ice and recoiled, shouting that the rock bites. They didn't know how to store it. They had no ice houses. The entire first shipment melted right on the dock. Frederick lost a fortune, but he didn't give up. Oh no. He found himself in debtor's prison. Once, twice, 3 times. Yet every time he regained his freedom, he returned to the ponds. He devised an insulation system, filling it with wood shavings. It was brilliant. The shavings acted like a thermos. Now the ice could travel for months, losing only a small portion of its weight. Tudor became a true missionary of cold. He would enter bars in hot countries, order a drink, and before the astonished audience, drop in a chunk of ice. He let people taste it. He taught bartenders how to make cocktails. He was explaining to the doctors how to bring down fevers using cold compresses. But wait, it was even more ambitious than that. he set his sights on India. The year was 1833. He embarked on a journey that lasted 4 months, crossing the equator twice. By the time the ship Toscana arrived in Calcutta, there were still 2/3 of the cargo in the hold. It was nothing short of a miracle. Indian Maharajas and British colonizers were willing to pay any amount for this ice. In Calcutta, they even constructed a special building known as the Ice House, which remains standing to this day. Frederick Tudor became a multi-millionaire. The man whom all of Boston mocked transformed into the Ice King. He built an industry from nothing, frozen water, which was previously considered a waste product. Thanks to him, people in India could drink cool water and doctors could preserve medications. He changed the habits of an entire world. And it was all due to sheer stubbornness and ordinary wood shavings. There's a lesson in this. Sometimes what lies at our feet and seems utterly useless can become a golden mine. You just need to figure out how to deliver it to those who truly need it, even if half of it melts along the way. Speaking of things that change their properties depending on the location, in the next story we will discuss how a common kitchen ingredient led to a real war. And no, it's neither salt nor sugar. It was something far more piquant. Story number 14. The Battle of Karanchbesh, or how the Austrian army defeated itself during a party. Now listen, we all enjoy having a good time. Celebrations, feasts, dancing until dawn. It's perfectly normal. Yet sometimes, merriment can lead to too much chaos, especially when armed and surrounded by wild lands. Let us travel back to the year 178 in the town of Karanchbesh, present-day Romania. The Austrian army was readying itself for war against the Turks. A tough campaign lay ahead, filled with heat, marshes, and battles. And one day, a few hussars decided to let loose a little. They stumbled upon a couple of wagons filled with rum, grabbed a couple of roasted pigs, set tables, and went on a bender. The Austrian army wasn't just any bunch of Cossacks. It was all about discipline and schedule. Each soldier knew his place. But hussars were free-spirited and daring. The wine flowed abundantly, and songs echoed loudly. Suddenly, infantrymen arrived. They were hungry too and wanted to drink. At first, everything was cordial, but then a quarrel erupted. "Hey, hussars, move aside. We want some too. What are you doing sitting here? We got here first." There were shouting and swearing. The hussars drew their sabers, and the infantrymen brandished their bayonets. A brawl ensued. One hussar shouted something that resembled "halt" and "habachnaps," which meant something like "stop, I have schnapps." However, amidst a mix of German, Hungarian, and Slavic dialects, the phrase sounded like "halt, Turki," meaning "attention, Turks." At first glance, there seemed to be nothing significant about it, but the situation escalated with dark sounds of yelling and gunfire around, and a vast, frightened army that had no idea what was happening. Someone yelled, "Turks!" Panic swept through the ranks. Soldiers, bewildered by the chaos, began shooting in all directions, accidentally firing upon their own. The commanders attempted to restore order, but their efforts were in vain. Some shouted that it was an ambush, while others called for help, even though no one was attacking. A few simply hid behind barrels of gunpowder, which also began to explode. The most terrifying aspect of all of this was that it took place under the cover of night, amidst chaos, where no one could distinguish friend from foe. By dawn, the fighting had subsided. The battlefield was strewn with hundreds of the dead and wounded. The Austrian army had suffered more casualties than in all their encounters with the actual Turks combined. Yet, ironically, there were no Turks present at all. The enemies simply did not exist. The Austrians had fought amongst themselves due to a drunken brawl and a false rumor. When the real Turkish forces finally arrived, they found the battlefield littered with corpses. It is said they didn't even have to kill anyone. They simply took the city without firing a single shot. The Austrians surrendered. This tale serves as a paradigm of how one can lose a war without ever facing an enemy. It illustrates how drunkenness, panic, and poor communication can dismantle even the mightiest armies. Sometimes I feel that history resembles a colossal party where everyone periodically argues and starts to bicker. Speaking of disputes, in the next story, we will delve into how an ordinary monk who had devoted his life to serving God committed an act worthy of a notorious villain while breaking none of the commandments. Story number 15, The Pills of the Devil's Fruit, or why your great-grandfather might have treated himself with ketchup. You see, we are so accustomed to that red bottle in the fridge that we hardly give it a thought. Ketchup is merely a condiment for fries, burgers, well, you get the idea. However, if we were to travel back to America in the early 19th century, say, the year 1830, and suggested that someone eat a spoonful of this concoction, we would likely be regarded as madmen or poisoners. The truth is, during that time, tomatoes were thought to be poisonous. Yes, they were referred to as devil's apples. People believed that consuming this bright red fruit could result in anything from dreadful rashes to, at worst, crossing over to the afterlife. They were grown solely for ornamental purposes in gardens and flower beds. Admire, and then step away. And then Dr. John Cook Bennett entered the scene. A man who possessed not only a medical degree, but also an incredible knack for turning air, or tomatoes, into profit. In 1834, Bennett decided to go against the grain. He declared that tomatoes were not poisonous. On the contrary, they were the greatest medicine in human history. He claimed they could cure everything, from indigestion and rheumatism to influenza and even cholera. Listen, he didn't just suggest eating them. He began to produce tomato pills. Imagine the frenzy. People who had feared even touching a tomato for decades suddenly lined up for pills made from them. It was a true tomato craze. Bennett became a millionaire almost overnight. His pharmacies were packed with individuals eager to find cures for all ailments at once, using concentrated ketchup in capsules. However, wait, it gets even more absurd. Bennett found himself facing competitors. The market became flooded with counterfeit tomato pills. A con artist named Archibald Miles began to sell a common laxative under the guise of tomato extract. People consumed them, experienced, let's say, effects, and believed that tomatoes were cleansing them of their ailments. Ultimately, after 10 years, this entire empire of red gold collapsed. Doctors proved that the pills were ineffective, and Miles was caught in his deceit. The trend of tomato treatment faded just as quickly as it had begun. However, one very important side effect remained. While people spent a decade consuming these pills and eating Bennett's medicinal sauces, they grew accustomed to the taste of tomatoes. They realized that consuming them didn't result in growing horns or anything dreadful. The fear vanished. But the flavor lingered, and when the pills disappeared from the shelves, the recipes for the sauces found their way into home kitchens. Thus, from a dubious medicine in capsules, emerged the ketchup that we so casually slather on our hot dogs today. If it weren't for one enterprising doctor who decided to capitalize on people's fears, we might still be avoiding tomatoes, regarding them merely as garden decorations. To be honest, sometimes I feel that the entire narrative of our civilization is nothing more than a series of fortunate misconceptions. And you know, if a delicious sauce is the outcome of an error, I am willing to forgive history for any absurdity. By the way, speaking of absurdities and things that change in meaning, our next story is about a man who believed he could deceive not only doctors, but also death itself, using only his imagination and an exceptionally long stick. Story number 16. A plywood ghost town that was supposed to save the city of light. Have you ever wondered how one might conceal an entire city? Not a wallet, not keys, but a huge, bustling, shining Paris with its Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, and endless boulevards. Sounds like a challenge for a highly ambitious magician, right? However, truth be told, in 1918, it wasn't a show, it was a matter of survival. The First World War was underway, and although we agreed not to discuss the grim, this story is quite the opposite. It's about incredible cunning. The French faced a new problem. German bombers began conducting nighttime raids. There were no radars at the time. The navigation for pilots was, to be frank, fairly inadequate. They relied on the lights below and the bends of the River Seine. Spot a bend, see a glowing spot, drop the payload. And so the French government decided, why not build another Paris? Imagine the scale of this, not a theater set, but an entire duplicate city. It was constructed just a few kilometers north of the real Paris, in a place called Maison Lafitte. This was Paris number 2. Engineers created 3 zones. In the first zone, they reconstructed railway tracks and the railway station of Dinant. However, listen, these were not real tracks. They were wooden replicas. The train cars were also made of wood and painted canvas. Even the smoke from the locomotives was mimicked using special chemicals. But the most brilliant aspect wasn't in the wood, it was in the light. They employed an engineer named Fernand Jacopot. Remember this name because later this individual would illuminate the real Eiffel Tower. Jacopot devised a lighting system that appeared like a living city from above. He utilized white, yellow, and red lamps that glowed dimly, mimicking the light coming from windows with drawn curtains. There were fake street lamps and imitation factories with illuminated glass roofs. Well, wait a second. They even created the effect of moving trains. Jacopot developed a lamp system that lit up sequentially, producing the illusion of glowing windows in a passing train. From a height of 1,000 meters, the pilot could see a perfect target. There was the bend of the Seine. In this spot, the river meandered almost the same way. There was the train station, and there were the factory quarters. "Look," shouted the navigator, "there it is, Paris, straight ahead." And they dropped their cargo into a clear field on plywood houses and canvas locomotives. Meanwhile, the real Paris stood in complete darkness, holding its breath only 15 kilometers away. This project was so secretive that it became known only decades after the war. But frankly speaking, the second Paris was doomed to never face real battle. The war ended before the construction was fully completed, and the models were simply dismantled. Yet, the very idea of building a ghost town to deceive the skies, is that not the pinnacle of architectural irony? We construct buildings to inhabit them, yet sometimes we must build structures so that other buildings may survive. You know, there's a certain nobility in that, creating an illusion to save reality. Speaking of illusions and the importance of timely recognition of deception, in our next story, we'll discuss a man who believed he could deceive not enemy pilots, but the very nature of things, using a simple button and a great deal of patience. Story number 17. The Longest Tea Party on the Shallows, or How 14 Ships Created Their Own Country. Have you ever been stuck in traffic? You know, one of those times when everything is at a standstill, the air conditioning can't keep up, and the radio is playing the same song for the 10th time? That's probably quite annoying. Now imagine your traffic jam lasting not 1 hour, or 2, or even 1 day. Picture being stuck for 8 years, not in a car, but on a massive cargo ship in the middle of a desert. This story began in June of 1967. The setting is the Suez Canal, the most crucial waterway in the world. 14 merchant vessels from various countries, including Britain, Poland, Germany, the United States, and Sweden, found themselves occupied with their routes. Some were carrying wool, others children's toys, and some thousands of tons of apples. Suddenly, bam, a political crisis hits, and the canal gets closed. The entrances were blocked on both sides by sunken ships and mines, leaving our heroes trapped in the widest part of the canal, known as the Great Bitter Lake. To be honest, initially everyone thought it would last a couple of days, maximum a week. The captains instructed the crews to scrub the decks and await further orders. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, as the sun in the Egyptian desert beamed down so fiercely that one could fry an egg right on board. The ships quickly became covered with a layer of yellow sand, which led to their nickname, the Yellow Fleet. And that's where the most intriguing part began. Sailors are known for their industrious nature. Sitting idly and staring at the dunes soon became tiresome for them. So they decided, since we can't leave, let's establish our own government here. Thus, the Association of the Greater Bitter Lake was formed. This was the oddest republic in history. They had their own regulations and traditions. Imagine this. Every Sunday, on the British ship Inverkeithing, they held a church service. The German vessel hosted a cinema, while the Swedish ship had a proper swimming pool, and the Polish boat was turned into a communal post office. Speaking of the post, this is simply incredible. The sailors began producing their own postage stamps, hand-drawing them, and, astonishingly, Egyptian authorities recognized these stamps. Letters emblazoned with the symbols of the Yellow Fleet were sent all around the globe. But wait, there's something even crazier. In 1968, when the Olympics were taking place in Mexico City, the sailors decided to join in. They organized their own Greater Bitter Lake Olympics. Teams from various countries competed in weightlifting, cargo hauling from the holds, rescue races, rowing, and even soccer. They set up the soccer field on the largest ship, the British vessel Sea Lion. Can you imagine playing soccer on the deck in the middle of a desert under the blazing sun? Isn't that a triumph of the human spirit? They were engaged in trade exchanges, with genuine bartering taking place. German beer was swapped for Swedish steel, while British tea was traded for American cigarettes. Over time, the crews changed, and people were sent home, but the ships remained. A small group was always stationed on board to keep the Iron Giants alive. 8 years passed. It wasn't until 1975 that the canal was finally cleared. When the gates opened, of the 14 vessels, only 2 managed to start their engines and sail out of the lake under their own power: the German ships Münsterland and Nordwind. Upon their arrival at the port of Hamburg, they were greeted as heroes. Tens of thousands lined the shore to welcome the vessels that had returned home from the longest cruise in history. I think this story illustrates that even in the most hopeless situations, even when trapped inside an iron box in the midst of sand, a person can always find a way to remain human. Build a pool, design a stamp, or play soccer. Life is a stubborn thing. It always finds a way, much like that German ship. Speaking of ships and what sometimes lies beneath the water, our next story is about a place that is both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a location where time has literally stood still, preserving secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. Story number 18. The Botanist in Disguise. Who stole the secret behind 5 seals? By the way, do you enjoy tea? You know, the real aromatic kind that warms your heart from the first sip? We drink it every day without a second thought. But once upon a time, this beverage was the cause of true espionage games that make any James Bond adventure seem tame. Instead of pistols, our hero had pots filled with soil, and instead of a tuxedo, he donned a fake braid. Let's transport ourselves to 1848, London. Fog, dampness, and the headquarters of the Ostindien Company. At that time, Britain faced an enormous problem. They absolutely loved tea, but all of it came from China, a country that was closed off, harsh, and extremely suspicious during those years. The secret of tea cultivation was guarded as jealously as state secrets are today. Foreigners were not permitted deep into the country, under threat of severe consequences, to put it mildly, and attempting to smuggle tea seeds could lead to the loss of one's head, literally. Thus, the British concluded, we need our own tea in India, which means we require someone to sneak into China and steal it. This someone was Robert Fortune, a botanist, gardener, and a man who adored plants more than anything else and, as it turned out, possessed nerves of steel. Imagine this audacious venture. Fortune understood that if he approached as a European, he wouldn't make it a mile. He decided to put on a disguise. He shaved his forehead and glued a long braid made from horsehair to the back of his neck. This hairstyle was a requirement in China at that time, and he wore a silk mandarin robe, or at least that of a wealthy merchant. He even learned a few dialects, although his accent remained atrocious. He told everyone he hailed from a distant province beyond the Great Wall. This charade worked for 3 years. Can you believe it? For 3 years, this man wandered through secret tea plantations in the mountains, where no European had ever stepped foot. He lived in monasteries, drank tea with monks, made sketches, and stole. He collected seeds, dug up saplings, and concealed them in special glass boxes, sort of portable greenhouses. To be honest, he came close to being unmasked a couple of times. Once, his servants nearly betrayed him, and another time, his boat was attacked by pirates. Yet Fortune, the quiet gardener, remained unshaken. He grabbed an old gun, fired it into the air, and scared off the pirates so much that they fled, convinced that this Mandarin was some sort of insane martial arts master. In the end, he managed to smuggle out over 20,000 tea bushes and thousands of seeds from China. But wait, the most important part was something else. He didn't just steal plants, he stole the very technology. Fortune discovered that black tea and green tea were, in fact, the same plant, just processed differently. Prior to this, Europe believed they were two distinct types of trees. He brought all of this back to India, at the foothills of the Himalayas, and tea thrived there. Thus, a vast tea empire arose in Darjeeling and Assam. China's monopoly crumbled, all thanks to one stubborn Scotsman who wasn't afraid to wear a fake braid and venture into the unknown in search of a bush in a pot. Today, when you brew a tea bag or scoop loose tea into a kettle, think of Robert Fortune. His masquerade made this drink accessible to all of us. You know, there's a certain irony in this. The global economy changed because one botanist turned out to be damn good at acting. Speaking of actors, let's consider how important it is to choose the right role. Our next story is about a man who didn't steal secrets, but instead crafted a mystery that the greatest minds of the century struggled to unravel. And it all began with a simple walk along the beach. Story number 19. How London's refuse saved Moscow from the ashes of devastation. Have you ever paused to think about what happens to everything we throw away? You know, like plastic bags, wrappers, and old belongings. Typically, we simply take the trash bag out and forget about it forever. Waste is dirty. It holds no value. But imagine London in the early 19th century, a city where dirt was quite literally gold. Let's travel back to the year 1812. At that time, London was heated by coal. Each household, each fireplace, every factory emitted smoke alongside tons of ash and soot. This gray residue piled high in massive mounds on the outskirts. A whole caste of people emerged. The dustmen. Honestly, they were the richest poor folks in the world. They sifted through the city's dust, separating bones, rags, and, most importantly, ash. Meanwhile, on the other end of Europe, something horrific was unfolding. Napoleon marched into Moscow, and nearly the entire city was engulfed in flames. The vast metropolis turned into a black wasteland, where only the wind and despair roamed among the charred ruins. Once the French departed, the Russians needed to rebuild the city urgently before winter set in. But for construction, bricks were essential, millions of bricks. And to produce bricks, vast amounts of ash were needed. Ash is added to clay to ensure the bricks are strong and properly fired. In war-torn Russia, ash was in short supply. Enter British ingenuity, leading to perhaps the strangest trade deal in history. Picture an enormous dusty mound by Grace Inn Road in London. This pile of rubbish was as tall as a 5-story building. It had been growing for decades. The owner of this heap, a certain Mr. Henry Dodd, known as the Golden Dustman, struck a contract. It sounds ludicrous, doesn't it? London's refuse, the ash from the fireplaces of English lords and dock workers, began to be loaded onto ships. Thousands of tons of dull gray dust set sail across seas and rivers towards far-off Russia. All this debris became the foundation for the new walls of Moscow. But wait, it was even bigger than that. Brick factories around Moscow operated day and night, mixing English ash with Russian clay. The buildings that stand today in the heart of Moscow, the palaces we regard as symbols of grandeur, are literally made from the London dust of the early 19th century. Old England helped to rise from the ashes of old Russia. Mr. Dodd earned such a fortune from this deal that he bought himself an estate and became a respected gentleman. Meanwhile, London's mountains of refuse vanished, transforming into beautiful boulevards in Moscow. You know, there's a certain profound justice in this. What was a burden and filth for one city became a salvation and the foundation of new life for another. We are all interconnected in ways that are much deeper than we might believe, even through the ashes in a fireplace. By the way, speaking of things that may seem fragile but are actually stronger than stone, in our next tale, we will discuss the tiniest and most stubborn creature that managed to triumph over a great emperor merely by standing still. This is story number 20, the cheese giant that united a nation and made the president sweat. Now, let me ask you, have you ever given someone a gift that was, shall we say, a bit too large? Not in terms of it being the wrong size, but rather the kind that can't fit through a door, weighs over a ton, and has an odor that permeates the entire street? We typically mull over a card or a tie. However, the residents of the town of Cheshire in Massachusetts decided in 1801 not to hold back. They chose to present the newly inaugurated President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, with a cheese. Just one single wheel of cheese, but the size of a small planet. Frankly, this wasn't just a culinary impulse, it was a political statement. At that time, people took their political views very seriously. The citizens of Cheshire were staunch supporters of Jefferson and his ideas of freedom. To demonstrate their loyalty, the local pastor, John Leland, an energetic and charismatic man, proposed the creation of a mammoth cheese. Imagine this process. It turned into a real community project. On one fine day in July, 900 cows, yes, that many, were milked. But hold on, there was an important detail. Pastor Leland strictly prohibited using milk from cows owned by Federalists, Jefferson's political opponents. Only Democratic milk from free cows was permitted. This was perhaps the first instance of political selection in dairy production in history. They built a giant press. The vat was 2 meters wide. The cheese was pressed by the entire community while singing hymns. When it was finally ready, it weighed 1,235 pounds. That's more than 550 kilograms. A massive yellow, odorous symbol of public affection. But how to transport this delicacy to Washington? The roads were scarce. It was winter. Leland loaded the cheese onto enormous sleds and set off. The journey lasted 3 weeks. Imagine a peculiar caravan traveling through snowy woods and fields, with a gigantic wheel of cheese wrapped in cloth proudly leading the way on the sled. In every town they were met by crowds. People came out to gaze upon the cheese mammoth as if it were the 8th wonder of the world. On January 1st, 1802, Leland knocked on the doors of the White House. Jefferson was taken aback. He accepted the gift, yet being a man of strict principles, insisted on paying Leland $100 for it so it wouldn't appear as a bribe. The cheese resided in the Eastern Room, where it remained for quite some time, a very long time. This cheese became the main attraction of the capital. It was served at official receptions. Dignitaries tasted it. It was sliced into pieces and distributed to those who wished for a sample. Legend has it that the last piece of this legendary gift was consumed 2 years after its arrival. Can you imagine the aroma lingering in the corridors of power by the end of the 2nd year? Yet no one complained. It was the scent of democracy. This cheese giant made Cheshire famous across the entire nation. He demonstrated that when people unite for a common, albeit slightly unusual purpose, they can achieve something truly remarkable, or at least very delicious. Sometimes I feel that we lack the straightforwardness to come together and accomplish something grand, just to express gratitude without pretense, with humor and warmth. Speaking of things that start as a joke but end up changing the world, in our next story, we will explore a man who believed he could defy gravity using nothing but ordinary fabric and a dream. This became the most beautiful and serene adventure that the sky had ever witnessed. Story number 21. The ship that became stuck between centuries without leaving the deck. Have you ever pondered the peculiar nature of time? We are accustomed to it flowing in a straight line, second by second, tick-tock. You glance at the clock, and it is either today or already tomorrow. However, imagine a place where today, tomorrow, last year, and the next century are all mixed into a thick, incredible cocktail. And this all happened on the deck of a regular passenger steamer. Picture the Pacific Ocean, a calm sea, mirror-like waters reflecting stars of such brightness that it seems the sky has fallen into the ocean. The year is 1900, December 31st, the eve of a new century. On the captain's bridge of the ship Arimu stands a man named John Phillips. To be honest, he was one of those captains who adored precision. Navigational charts, sextants, chronometers. That was his element. And now, examining the instruments, he realizes they are approaching a point that occurs once in a lifetime, or perhaps once in 1,000 years. Phillips calls for the navigator. "What is our position?" he asks. "We are right on course, sir. We will soon cross the equator." "And what is our longitude?" "We are on the 181st meridian." Suddenly, Phillips has a revelation. He commanded a slight course change, just enough for the ship to remain in the unique position. At midnight, precisely at 12 o'clock, Adimu found itself at the intersection of the equator and the international dateline. Silence. Just the steady hum of the engines. Imagine what occurred at that moment. The ship had already crossed the equator and the dateline, but the stern had not yet done so. This was truly an explosion of logic. The bow of the ship was in the southern hemisphere. It was summer. January 1st, 1902. No, wait, it was still 1901, the 20th century, a Monday. And the stern? The stern was still in the northern hemisphere. It was winter. December 31st, 1899, the 19th century, a Sunday. The same ship, the same crew, yet the people at the bow were already living in the future century, celebrating summer and a new weekday, while those at the stern were sipping tea in the previous century, bundled in winter coats, bidding farewell to the old Sunday. The distance between the bow and the stern was only a few dozen meters, but those meters separated 2 centuries, 2 seasons, 2 years, and 2 days. Wait, Phillips did this intentionally. He wanted to offer his passengers something that cannot be purchased for any amount of money, a moment of absolute timelessness. It is said that at that midnight on the deck, there was neither noise nor cries of hooray. Everyone simply remained silent. People traversed from bow to stern and back, embarking on journeys through time that spanned 100 years in just a few steps. It felt almost miraculous. A violation of all laws of physics and bureaucracy, as if the universe had briefly closed its eyes and allowed a small iron vessel to slip through the gears of existence. You know, there's something philosophical about this. We rush after time, so afraid of being late, when in reality, it's enough to simply be in the right place to realize that time is just a line on a map that we ourselves have drawn. Speaking of lines and boundaries we create in our minds, our next story will be about a man who believed he could not only cross borders, but also create his own unique country, right where no one expected him. And his weapon in this endeavor was not cannons, but ordinary playing cards. Story number 22. A Chef on a Thin Line, or How to Prepare Dinner Over an Abyss. So, do you have a fear of heights? You know, the kind that makes your head spin when you look down from a 10th floor balcony. That must be a normal feeling, a self-preservation instinct. But imagine a person for whom the abyss was merely a workspace, a place where one could not only stroll, but also tend to everyday tasks, like making breakfast. Let's transport ourselves to Niagara Falls. The year was 1859, June 30th. At that time, Niagara was wild, roaring, and utterly merciless. Thousands of tons of water thundered downward, spray, mist, chaos. And there, above this maelstrom, a cable stretched 50 meters up, over 330 meters in length. It appeared as a thin thread against the backdrop of the giant torrents of water. On the edge of the gorge stood a man named Jean-François Gravelet, but the world would remember him as the Great Blondin. To be honest, the crowd gathered on the banks, approximately 25,000 people, wasn't there to celebrate the human spirit. Let's be frank, they were waiting for a disaster. But the blonde had a different opinion. He stepped onto the wire in a pink costume, a heavy balance pole in hand, and calmly walked across, as if strolling down a Parisian boulevard. But that wasn't enough for him. You see, he was a true showman. Halfway across, the blonde suddenly paused, remained still, took out a small flask from his pocket, sipped some wine, and glanced at the spectators. Then, he sat right down on the wire. Before the eyes of those fainting in disbelief, he lay back, stretched out, and began to admire the clouds. Below him was the roaring abyss, and he was at ease. But wait, the craziest trick was yet to come. During one of the subsequent crossings, he brought a cast iron stove onto the wire. Yes, a real heavy cooking stove. He strapped it to his back, made it to the middle of the gorge, set the stove down on the wire, and lit a fire. Picture this scene: smoke rising up, sparks flying into the water, while the blonde pulls out a frying pan and starts to cook an omelet. He cracked the eggs, stirred them, and when breakfast was ready, he gingerly lowered it down with a rope to a passenger on the tourist steamboat, Misty Lady, that was passing far below. People couldn't believe their eyes. It was beyond reality. The blonde man crossed Niagara dozens of times. He did this with his eyes blindfolded. He walked on stilts. He even carried his manager on his back. Just imagine the state of that manager. Poor guy must have repented for all his sins committed since childhood during those 10 minutes. But the blonde remained unshakable. He trusted his body in balance just as one would trust the ground beneath their feet. Do you want to know the secret to his success? He said, "Never look down, focus on your goal. The tightrope is your world, and the world cannot betray you." He lived a long life and passed away in his bed, the only person to have tamed Niagara without getting his feet wet. I believe this story illustrates that the limits of possibility reside only in our minds. If you can fry an egg over a waterfall, then nothing is impossible for you. The key is to believe in your balance. Speaking of belief and how one small idea can alter the fate of an entire nation, our next tale will discuss the most mysterious and quiet revolution in the history of a country. A revolution without weapons, but with one very important book and a person who decided that knowledge should be free for all. Story number 23. A man under a strange dome who declared war on the rain and the coachman. Have you ever pondered how ordinary things become commonplace? Take the umbrella, for instance, a small, foldable gadget in your bag. It starts to rain, you open it, and carry on. No magic, no grandeur. But imagine London in the mid-16th century, in the year 1750. The street is experiencing a downpour, a true British flood where the sky merges with the pavement. And then a gentleman named Jonas Hanway steps into the street. He's dressed in the latest fashion, but above his head is a peculiar construction made of whalebone and oiled fabric. To be honest, today no one would notice him, but back then, oh, that was a scandal, a real social explosion. People stopped and pointed at him. Children laughed. Ladies covered their mouths with their fans. Why? Because in England at that time, carrying an umbrella was seen as a sign of, let's say, excessive femininity. Worse still, it was considered overly French. The English of the 16th century would rather have soaked themselves to the bone and caught a terrible cold than appear like a Frenchman, or, heaven forbid, like a delicate lady. A gentleman under an umbrella was absurd. It was a challenge to society. But Hanway was no fool. He had recently returned from travels in the East and Europe, where he had seen how people protected themselves from the sun and rain using such devices. He simply could not care less about other people's opinions. He just wanted to stay dry. However, he gained enemies more serious than mere mockers: the coachmen. Imagine the London cab drivers, hackney drivers. For them, rain was a golden opportunity. Want to stay dry? Hire a carriage, pay up. And here comes some clever fellow with a roof over his head that folds away. It was a direct blow to their business. Hold on, it was actually much harsher. The haters initiated a real campaign of bullying. When John was walking down the street with his umbrella, they would deliberately splash in puddles just to douse him in mud. They shouted insults at him. Once, an especially zealous coachman even tried to run him over with his cart. And do you know what Jonas did? He just kept strolling along. 30 years. Think about that number. For 30 years, he took to the streets of London with his umbrella in hand at every possible opportunity, whether convenient or not. 2 generations of Londoners had laughed at him. He was called the Mushroom Man. He became an urban legend, a sort of local eccentric, yet always neat and dry. However, gradually, drop by drop, pardon the pun, Jonas's stubbornness began to bear fruit. People started to notice one detail. Jonah never caught a cold. His expensive cloaks lasted 3 times longer because they weren't ruined by water and mud. He didn't spend a fortune on carriages, and thus it started with one brave soul, then another, and then the 10th. Merchants, who needed to protect their goods, began to buy umbrellas. Doctors, who had to rush to sick patients in any weather, also appreciated the invention. By the time of his death in 1786, London could not imagine itself without umbrellas. The demand became so great that the first specialized workshops opened. Coachmen grumbled, but were forced to accept it. Their monopoly on being dry was shattered by one stubborn old man. Jonas Henry died knowing he conquered not just the rain, but human folly as well. I believe this is a story about the fact that being an oddball or mushroom man isn't always negative. Sometimes it takes 30 years of enduring mockery to leave the world a little drier and more comfortable for everyone else. True courage is to stand against the crowd with an ordinary umbrella in hand. By the way, about things that seem fragile but can withstand any test. In our next story, we will discuss the most peculiar traveler who spent decades on the road without legs, a map, or even consciousness. His journey helped scientists unravel a mystery that has troubled humanity for thousands of years. Story number 24. A war that people lost to birds that never fired a shot. Have you ever felt like everything is going sideways? You know, when you plan the perfect day and it falls apart due to some trivial issue. It happens. But honestly, this is nothing compared to what a whole army of professionals experienced when they faced an enemy that didn't even have arms. Just long legs, a beak, and a complete disregard for national borders. Let's travel to Australia. The year is 1932. It was a tough time, the Great Depression. Farmers, many of whom were World War I veterans, were trying to grow wheat in the harsh lands of Western Australia. And just when the harvest was nearly ready, a threat loomed on the horizon. But it wasn't locusts or drought. It was the emu ostriches, 20,000 of them. Imagine this scene. A massive gray avalanche of 20,000 birds, each the height of a person, charging onto the fields. They were not merely consuming wheat, oh no. They were breaking down fences, trampling crops, and leaving behind a scorched earth that rabbits eagerly jumped into. The farmers were in despair. They approached the Minister of Defense and declared, "We need machine guns." And the government agreed. This was officially dubbed the Great Emu War. Major Meredith, 2 soldiers, and 2 Lewis light machine guns were dispatched to the front line. They had 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was straightforward: go into the fields, catch the birds, and, well, you get the idea, problem solved. Major Meredith even envisioned his return to Canberra as a hero, with his soldiers receiving medals. But wait a minute, the birds turned out to be far more intelligent than biologists had expected. When the soldiers opened fire, the emus didn't panic, they scattered. Listen, they split into small groups of several birds and ran in different directions. The gunners simply couldn't rotate their barrels in time. The birds raced across the fields at speeds of 50 kilometers per hour. It was pure chaos. "Look," shouted one soldier. "They're using guerrilla tactics." And indeed, it was true. Each flock of emus had its own lookout. A massive bird stood on a hill, closely watching the soldiers. As soon as the troops got closer, the lookout would signal, and the flock would vanish into the bushes before a single round could be fired. Once, the military decided to employ a clever trick. They mounted a machine gun in the back of a truck and chased after a flock. This was supposed to be a triumph of technology over nature, but the truck bounced across the terrain so much that the gunner couldn't hit even a barn, while the birds simply leapt over obstacles and disappeared in the dust. Moreover, one of the birds somehow got entangled in the steering, and the vehicle nearly overturned. After a month of combat, Major Meredith was compelled to retreat. The results were disgraceful. Thousands of rounds had been spent, yet the birds continued to eat wheat. They didn't even realize they had been officially declared at war. Later, Major Meredith would remark with a mix of admiration and slight resentment, "If we had a division with such maneuverability and tenacity, we would conquer the world. Emus can face machine guns with the calmness of tanks." Ultimately, the government concluded that building sturdier fences was cheaper and more effective than attempting to shoot down 20,000 feathered gorillas. The birds won without a single shot fired in their direction. You know, there is a lesson in this. Sometimes nature tells us, hey, I was here before you, and my legs run faster than your bullets. We need to learn to negotiate rather than pull the trigger at every opportunity. Speaking of survival in the most unusual conditions and the importance of maintaining composure when the world crumbles around you, in our next story, we will discuss a man who found himself trapped in a place where silence was the only sound he would hear for years, and how he kept his sanity with only his thoughts and a small piece of clothing. Story number 25. The Red Giant on Ice, or How to Build a House with Wheels That Forgot How to Roll. Have you ever purchased something extremely expensive, powerful, and beautiful, only to realize that it simply doesn't function where it should? For instance, a rugged vehicle that gets stuck in the very first puddle of luck? It's certainly frustrating, but imagine the level of disappointment if your vehicle, the size of a 3-story building, costs as much as an entire fleet of airplanes, and you brought it to the ends of the earth where there are no repair shops or tow trucks, just ice and penguins. Let's transport ourselves to Chicago in the year 1939. At that time, America was defining Antarctica. This vast white expanse on the map represented the ultimate test for adventurers. Scientist and explorer Thomas Poulter believed that the age of dog sleds was over. It was time for technology. He designed an Antarctic snow cruiser. To be honest, it was the most ambitious vehicle ever created in human history. Picture this beast, 17 meters long, nearly 5 meters tall. It was painted in a bright red hue so it could be seen from space, if anyone were up there. Each of its wheels was 3 meters in height. Inside, it resembled a luxurious hotel, complete with living quarters, a modern kitchen, a laboratory, a workshop, and even a photo lab. And on the roof, believe it or not, there was a real airplane secured for reconnaissance purposes. It was a fortress on wheels and a proud testament to American engineering. As this giant rolled through the streets of Chicago towards the port, traffic came to a standstill. Thousands gathered to witness the mechanical nightmare come to life, slowly making its way to the ocean. But wait, there was one small detail that the ingenious Poulter overlooked. In January of 1940, the ship reached the shores of Antarctica. A massive crane lowered the cruiser onto the ice. A crowd of polar explorers held their breath. Poulter started the engines, 2 of them, each boasting 300 horsepower. The powerful roar echoed across the frozen wilderness. The vehicle began to move, and then there was silence. It turned out that the enormous, smooth, treadless wheels, which looked so magnificent on the asphalt in Chicago, had turned into useless rollers on the Antarctic ice. They merely spun in place, polishing the snow without shifting the massive structure even a millimeter. The cruiser, weighing 35 tons, helplessly slid around in the snowdrifts. It was a monumental failure, a technical knockout. Poulter and his team refused to give up. They began to improvise. They affixed spare wheels to the front, increasing the area of support. They even tried to go in reverse. Ironically, the vehicle moved slightly better backward. Thus, they crawled across Antarctica, a huge, bright red house with an airplane on its roof, edging backward at a turtle's pace. Eventually, after weeks of struggling, they recognized that they weren't going any farther. The snow cruiser had transformed into the most expensive and comfortable polar station in the world. The scientists simply stayed inside. It was warm and cozy, equipped with radio communication and a year's worth of food. They conducted research while lounging on the leather sofas of their immobile giant. Then World War II began, and the expedition faded from memory. The cruiser was left behind in the snow. It was discovered once in the 40s, then again in 1958, at which time only the tall antennae was visible above the snow. Researchers unearthed the entrance, ventured inside, and found everything preserved in pristine condition. Magazines lay on tables, beds were neatly made, and even spare candles were tucked away in drawers. Then it vanished. Most likely, the glacier on which the red giant stood broke off and transformed into an iceberg. Somewhere in the depths of the Southern Ocean, this marvel of technology from 1939 still rests on the seabed. You know, there is something strangely enchanting about this. Sometimes even the most brilliant idea can falter in the face of harsh reality. But even if your cruiser can't move, it can still provide a warm refuge amid the icy wilderness. The key is not to forget to bring good company and a stash of coffee. Speaking of homes that shouldn't be where they are, in our next story, we'll discuss the most mysterious resident in the world who managed to build an entire empire without stepping outside and made the whole world play by his rules using only silence and a very sharp sense of hearing. Story number 26. The wheel meant to humiliate the Eiffel Tower. So, do you enjoy fairs? You know, the kind filled with the aromas of popcorn and cotton candy, along with the bright lights of the rides. Today, we take the Ferris wheel for granted. It spins slowly and, frankly, can be a bit dull for kids. But imagine Chicago in the year 1893 at the World's Fair. America was in a frenzy. Why? Because 4 years earlier, the Eiffel Tower had been built in Paris. The whole world was buzzing about it. The French were proud, while the Americans were green with envy. They needed something that would make the world gasp. Something taller, more powerful, and more astonishing. A competition was announced. Architects submitted outrageous ideas. A tower taller than the Eiffel Tower made entirely of wood, or a tower that stood upside down. Then George Ferris, an engineer from Pittsburgh, stepped up. He proposed building a colossal steel wheel that would lift people into the sky. Truth be told, when he presented his blueprints, the fair board thought the guy was simply insane. You want to suspend 800 tons of steel in the air on a single axis, they questioned? That will collapse and crush the visitors. Ferris was turned down, but he was one of those people who didn't understand the word no. He found the funding himself, pouring every penny of his fortune into the project. He believed in the mathematics more than the fears of the laypeople. Now imagine this behemoth, a wheel standing 80 meters tall. Its axle alone weighed 45 tons, making it the largest steel component ever forged in human history at that point. Instead of small open cabins like we see today, Ferris constructed tram cars. Yes, 36 cars the size of buses, each featuring 40 seats, though they could accommodate up to 60 people. At any given time, over 2,000 individuals could be riding that wheel. This wasn't merely an attraction, it was a flying city. When the wheel started to turn for the first time, Chicago stood in awe. No one knew whether the structure would hold. However, it not only endured, but revolved with the precision of Swiss clockwork. Wait, there was one moment that frightened everyone and caused some gasps. During the exhibition in Chicago, a powerful hurricane struck. The winds were so fierce that roofs were torn off buildings. People at the exhibition fled in panic. Many were convinced that the Ferris wheel would collapse like a house of cards any moment. Meanwhile, at the very top of the wheel were some occupants. George Ferris and his wife had specifically entered one of the cabins to demonstrate its durability. He remained calm. The wheel didn't even budge. The wind howled through the steel spokes while the cabins gently swayed, offering passengers the most incredible view of the surging ocean of clouds. It was a triumph. Over the course of the exhibition, more than 1.5 million people rode the wheel. America had outdone France. The Ferris wheel became a symbol of a new era, an era of steel and incredible bravery. Unfortunately, George Ferris's fate was tragic, but his invention, which we now refer to as the Ferris wheel, or simply the observation wheel, forever altered the skyline of every city. There is a certain irony in this. We construct huge, heavy machines from steel and concrete solely to feel light, like birds, for a few moments and to view the world from above. Speaking of seeing from above and recognizing what others fail to notice, our next story is about a man who discovered an entire world within a single drop of water and made kings and scientists believe in what cannot be touched. All of this was thanks to his passion for common buttons and magnifying glasses. Story number 27. 4 boys, 1 dog, and a masterpiece that waited for its moment for 17,000 years. Listen, I promised you at the end of the last chapter to share a tale about a man with a microscope, but to be honest, I've changed my mind. That guy was indeed impressive, no doubt about that, but I found a story in my archives that fits the description of a great mystery much better. It's about the significance of looking not just through lenses, but also under your own feet, especially when wandering through a forest. Let's transport ourselves to France. September 1940. War, chaos, and uncertainty surrounded the region. Yet, in the small town of Montignac, four teenagers, Marcel, Jacques, Georges, and Simon, were preoccupied with a much more important task. They were searching for treasure. You know, every decent forest has to have a legend of hidden riches. The local elders whispered about an underground passage leading to an old mansion, and so our heroes, armed with determination and accompanied by a dog named Robot, yes, a fantastic name for a dog, wouldn't you agree, set off on their quest. Then, suddenly, Robot, this furry engine of progress, began to dig furiously at the roots of a fallen beech tree. The boys approached closer. There was a narrow crevice, dark, deep, and cold. Any normal adult would have said, "Boys, don't go in there, it's dangerous." But when you're 14, the phrase, "it's dangerous," sounds a lot like, "there's definitely gold in there." Marcel, the bravest of the four, widened the opening with a knife and slipped inside. He soared through the sloping tunnel for several meters and landed on soft clay. The darkness was complete, yet he had a small flashlight with him. Listen, just imagine that moment. A beam of light slices through the gloom that had lingered here for thousands of years. It glides along the walls and ceiling, causing Marcel to pause. He doesn't spot any gold coins. He doesn't see any chests. Instead, he observes a herd of bulls, massive, powerful, vibrant bulls that seem to sprint across the stone. "Hey guys," he shouted, "jump in here. There are horses, there are deer, everything is alive." Thus, the Lascaux Cave was discovered. The Sistine Chapel of the prehistoric world, as it would later be called. It was astounding. The cave walls were adorned with hundreds of paintings. 17,000 years ago, ancient artists used ochre and charcoal to capture the world around them. And to be honest, the level of skill was such that contemporary artists could only throw up their hands in disbelief. The dynamics, the volume, the understanding of anatomy, it wasn't mere childlike creativity of cave dwellers, it was great art. However, wait, the boys first decided to keep it all a secret. They wanted to keep the cave as their hidden headquarters. They would bring food and candles, spending hours in the company of painted bison. Discussing their affairs, they became the first audience at the longest exhibition in history, yet the secret proved too significant to be kept hidden. Eventually, they shared their discovery with their teacher, and the world gasped. The most touching part of this story is that Marcel and his friends remained loyal to their find for life. When the cave was open to tourists, they became the very first guides. They protected it, safeguarding each drawing from moisture and light, as if they were their own children. This tale reminds us that wonders are not always tucked away behind locked doors. Sometimes, they lie right beneath the roots of a tree you walk past every day. One merely needs the curiosity of a teenager and a faithful dog ready to start digging at the earth. You know, there's a bittersweet quality to it. We consider ourselves the pinnacle of civilization, yet 17,000 years ago, someone in the dark cave felt beauty just as we do. Speaking of things that endure through the ages without losing their essence, in our next story, we will discuss a man who believed he could build not just a building, but a monument to love, using nothing but old newspapers and a tremendous amount of patience. And this project turned into the most peculiar and inviting place in the entire state. Story number 28. An engineer who rolled the world into a tube and constructed a roof from it. So, have you ever wondered what a newspaper really is? Apart from being a source of news that turns into waste the next day. Typically, we use old newspapers to wrap fragile dishes when moving, or to lay down on the floor during renovations. This one-day item is fragile, thin, and seemingly worthless. But imagine a person who looked at a stack of newspapers and saw bricks. Let's travel to the town of Rockport, Massachusetts. The year is 1922. There lived a gentleman named Ellie Stenman, a reputable mechanical engineer. He had a passion. He loved inventing machines for producing paper clips. It may seem like a dry occupation filled with numbers and metal. However, when Stenman decided to build himself a summer house, he opted to conduct an experiment. Initially, Everything was going smoothly. He constructed a wooden frame and laid down the floors. But as he reached the walls, Ellis suddenly declared, "Why do I need wood? I have tons of newspapers." To be honest, at first, the neighbors thought it was just some temporary insulation, to keep it warmer. But Steinman didn't stop there. He began rolling newspapers into tight tubes, soaking them in a special paste made of flour, water, and apple peels, and then coating them with varnish. Listen, it wasn't merely a hobby. It became an obsession. The walls of the house began to take shape, layer by layer, newspaper by newspaper. Eventually, each wall consisted of 215 layers of compressed paper. Surprisingly, they turned out to be incredibly strong. The paper under the varnish became as hard as oak, while effectively retaining heat. Wait, that was just the beginning. Ellis got into the groove. He realized that buying furniture was dull, so he continued rolling the tubes. He crafted a table, chairs, and bookshelves out of newspapers. Even the curtains on the windows were made from the thinnest strips of paper. Imagine walking into a house and everything, absolutely everything, is something you can read. Ellis, friends would ask. What about a piano? You can't make a piano out of paper. Steinman just smiled. He took an old instrument that sounded terrible and covered its body with thousands of newspaper clippings, creating a unique resonating layer. It still works to this day. The entire house and furniture took about 100,000 newspapers to build. Inside, there were headlines about the end of the First World War, reports of the first flights across the ocean, announcements for horse sales, and advertisements for the earliest automobiles. Steinman literally preserved the history of his time within the walls of his home. Amazingly, this house still stands today. More than 100 years have passed. Wood rots, bricks crack. Yet the newspaper house in Rockport remains sturdy. Today, it serves as a museum. People enter and start reading the walls. You could spend hours exploring the news from a century ago just by looking at the legs of the dining table or the foot of the bed. There's a profound meaning in that. We tend to view information as fleeting. You read it and forget it. But Ellis Steinman proved that with a bit of effort and apple glue, even yesterday's gossip can become a reliable foundation for a roof overhead. This is a tale of persistence and of the fact that to a creative person, nothing is trash. There's only material waiting for its moment. Speaking of materials that seem fragile yet withstand the test of time, in our next story, we will discuss the quietest traveler in history who traversed 1,000 kilometers without even a map. His journey helped people understand that we are all part of one vast and intricate system, where even an ordinary rubber duck can serve as an important scientific instrument. Story number 29. The Great Army of Yellow Explorers Who Conquered the Ocean Without a Single Paddle. Listen, have you ever lost something in the sea? For instance, a sun hat to the wind or a flip-flop that drifted away while you weren't paying attention? Typically, we bid farewell to such losses with a sad glance and move on. The ocean took it, and it won't give it back. But imagine a scenario where a single small mishap unfolds into the largest scientific exploration in the history of humanity. The main characters in this story are just ordinary rubber ducks. The Pacific Ocean, January 1992. A cargo ship is making its way from China to Seattle. A vast iron vessel amidst a blue expanse. A storm. Waves as tall as a 5-story building. The ship tilts, and one of the containers, unable to withstand the tempest, crashes into the abyss. The metal crumples, the doors burst open, and 28,800 little plastic beings tumble into the frigid water. There were yellow ducks, red beavers, green frogs, and blue turtles, a true toy store landing party. To be honest, the manufacturing company simply sighed and logged the losses. Well, they sank, and that was that. Who knew that these little guys were built so well? They didn't sink. They had no holes for water. They were airtight. Thus began the journey of this army of silent sailors. Enter the scientists, oceanographers Curtis Ebbsmeyer and James Ingram. They realized they had a unique opportunity before them. Typically, scientists use special bottles with messages to study currents, releasing hundreds of them. but here were nearly 30,000 identical objects. An ideal experiment set up by fate itself. The ducks broke apart. They became genuine pioneers. Some of them washed ashore in Alaska after 10 months. Others, after several years, found their way to Australia and the Hawaiian Islands. But the most astonishing event occurred with the northern group. Several thousand toys became trapped in the Arctic ice. They drifted slowly alongside the ice floes across the North Pole. Just picture this scene: an endless white desert, temperatures around -50 degrees, and amidst it all, a small, faded but still optimistic yellow duck slowly gliding through. But wait, they weren't just drifting. 15 years after the incident, they began turning up on the eastern shores of the United States, and even in Scotland. They crossed the Atlantic. They ventured through ice storms, covering over 30,000 kilometers. Each discovery was worth its weight in gold for the scientists. Thanks to the friendly floaters, as the press dubbed them, we learned more about ocean currents than we had in all previous decades combined. People across the globe flocked to beaches in hopes of finding their yellow professor. Collectors pursued them. Their photographs were published in esteemed scientific journals. This is a tale of how even ordinary garbage can become a key to unlocking the mysteries of our planet, if viewed through a careful eye. We are all accustomed to planning, calculating, and building complex instruments, but sometimes the ocean just needs a few thousand rubber toys tossed in to reveal all its secrets. You know, there's a childlike magic in that. The world is a vast bathtub, and we're all swimming in it, hoping to someday reach the right shore. The key is to maintain buoyancy. Speaking of journeys that conclude far from their intended destinations, in our latest 30th tale, we will explore a place that exists at the intersection of reality and imagination. We will discuss an individual who believed he could construct not just a building, but a portal to another dimension, solely employing geometric principles that remain a mystery to most. This endeavor has become the most enigmatic legacy left behind in the sands. Story number 30. The Horologist of Millennia, or How to Conceal the Pulse of Humanity Within a Mountain. Imagine, if you will, a desert in Texas. The Sierra Diablo Mountains rise, the heat distorts the air, towering cacti surround you, and there's a silence so profound it feels tangible. Before you stands a solid rock face. No doors, no windows, just a narrow fissure leading deep into the heart of the stone. Upon entering, the coolness envelops you, and the air carries the scent of limestone and something ancient. You ascend a spiral staircase carved directly into the rock. With every step, you rise higher and higher until you suddenly hear it, a ticking sound. These are unusual timepieces. Unlike those on your wrist or in your phone, constantly buzzing and busy, these do not rush. They pulse slowly, majestically, as if they have no urgency, because they are designed to measure time for 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Contemplate that for a moment. When these clocks complete their first cycle, our world will have transformed entirely. Languages may shift, borders may change, and even the climate might alter. Yet, these clocks will continue to count the seconds. In truth, the concept originated in the mind of a man named Danny Hillis in 1986. He was a genius in computer science, creating supercomputers that could think faster than anything else on the planet. At some point, he realized that humanity had become too swift in its pace. We planned for a week, a month, or even a year ahead, losing sight of centuries. He decided to create a monument to long time. This astounding engineering marvel rises nearly 60 meters high. It's constructed from materials resistant to rust: stainless steel, titanium, and ceramics. There's no electricity, no batteries involved. The clocks harness energy from the temperature fluctuations between day and night in the desert. As the sun rises, the mountain heats up, and the clocks are wound. As the sun sets, they continue their march. However, the most astonishing aspect is the sound they produce. Hillis invited musician Brian Eno to devise a system of bells. Every day at noon, the clocks strike the bells, and thanks to a complex mechanism, the sequence of sounds never repeats. For 10,000 years, not a single melody will play twice. Each day offers a unique composition for the silent mountain. These clocks represent our message to the future. It's as if we are communicating with those who will come after us across countless generations, saying, "We were here. We thought of you. We believed that you would still be here to hear this sound." Inside the mountain, there are 5 special chambers, the chambers of celebration, designed for 1,000 years, 2,000, and 3,000. In the 1-year chamber, a model of the solar system already resides. As for what will occupy the others, we do not know. We left them empty to allow our descendants to decide what holds significance for them. This is a tale about hope, illustrating that a person is not merely a note in the whirlwind of events, but rather a being capable of glancing beyond the horizon of millennia. These clocks in Texas are ticking right now while you listen to my voice. They will continue to tick when your grandchildren are born. They will tick when the ruins of our cities are overtaken by forest. You know, there is something significant about this finale of our cycle. All the stories I have shared with you across these 30 chapters, from the pasta trees to the spy botanists, are also components of a larger mechanism, one of human memory and imagination. And there it is. Our archive is closed for today. To be honest, it has been a true pleasure to spend this time with you. We have weathered storms, laughed at adventurers, and marveled at the courage of loners. I hope these tales have made your world a little brighter and your evening cozier. Remember, life is filled with wonders. One just needs to learn to see them. And sometimes, it's simply about winding your inner clock for a long and happy life.